David Goodhart is a British journalist who's tracked the political shifts of his homeland and the author of The Road to Somewhere. David Goodhart, nice to have you here and welcome to Australia.
Thank you.
You've written this book, The Road to Somewhere, and you identify these two broad terms, the somewheres and the anywheres. Give us a sketch of who they are.
Yeah, I mean, the book is really about the value divides in modern Britain, although I think a lot of it does apply to other similar countries like Australia. And this is really about the kind of worldview conflict between the more highly educated people who tend to be quite mobile, particularly in the UK because of residential universities, but in most other countries too. They tend to be mobile, they tend to favour openness and autonomy, they're comfortable with high levels of immigration. They don't tend to have very strong group attachments or attachments to place.
So identities are more malleable.
Exactly, yeah. They have what's often called achieved identities. Their identity comes from passing exams
rather
when
than
young.
Ascribed identity, which is the somewheres.
Exactly, and then the other big worldview group, which tends to be bigger, I mean, anywheres are much bigger than people talk about kind of metropolitan elites and so on. And when I think of an elite, I think of kind of 3 or 5% of the population. We're talking about a lot more than that with anywheres, 25%, perhaps even 30% of the population, but they are a minority. Somewheres are a bigger group, perhaps about 50%, and they tend to be more rooted, tend to be less well educated, tend to value security and familiarity, and as you say, tend to have ascribed identities. And therefore, because ascribed meaning that they are, like, I mean, I'm a white male,
identities
British,
they're born into.
Exactly, things that are pretty immutable about you, and that their identities come from the group and the place and therefore, if their group or the place changes as a result of high immigration or whatever, they can be discomforted by that.
And you've identified a real inflection point here, a tension that exists politically around these two groups. Those who are the somewheres feel discarded, feel left out, feel left behind by globalisation, and feel as if, frankly, that they are looked down upon as well.
Yeah. And that is a problem. Now, I mean, both of these worldviews, and by the way, I've invented these labels. I haven't invented the worldview groups and their rough extent. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my nose in the British social attitude surveys and other opinion and survey reports, and I suspect I would find the same in the same material in the US or Australia or Canada. And they really do exist, these value groups. One can argue a little bit about the proportions I've attributed to them and so on. So that's one thing to remember. The other thing is that both of these worldviews in their mainstream form, you know, perhaps leaving out the more contemptuous anywheres and the more xenophobic somewheres, in their mainstream form, both of these worldviews are perfectly decent and legitimate. It's just that they conflict in certain pretty fundamental ways, and politics has not yet found a way of finding a kind of settlement between the two things.
And David, one of the issues, a lightning rod for this conflict, has been immigration. Why has immigration appeared to be such a vexed political issue with such force? It's changing. It's changing things at the ballot box.
I think for many somewheres, people from perhaps declining industrial regions, even if they don't necessarily have high numbers of immigrants in their area, think of large-scale immigration as part of their sort of reduction in status, or the way in which the national story has passed them by. You know,
when you hear them say, "I'm losing my country," do they have a sense that they have lost this sense of identity, and no one asked them?
Yeah, exactly, and it's because, I mean, the reason why we are seeing this pushback in things like Brexit and Trump and populism is because we've seen the complete domination of our politics and our economic policy and our education policy, massive expansion of higher education and so on, complete domination of our politics by anywheres over the last, 2 generations, last 30 years or so, and you know, and the somewheres. British common sense, Australian common sense used to be kind of somewhere common sense. I mean, they've always been anywheres, and they always had a disproportionate influence. But that worldview has completely has crept up rather slowly in, like I say, in the last couple of decades to completely dominate our societies. And somewheres have woken up to this and are pushing back, using the power of the vote.
David, it's fascinating when you look at immigration, because seems to be a paradox here. While the blowback of the somewheres and the concern around immigration may have been a factor in Trump's election and Brexit, those who are most exposed to immigration, those who live with immigrants in the cities, are voting to remain overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Is it immigration or the fear of immigration? How do you delineate those two?
It's partly both. I mean, for many somewheres, they look at particularly large-scale immigration. I mean, hardly anybody is against immigration per se. I mean, but we have had, by historical standards, we've had historically unprecedentedly high levels of immigration in the last 20 years or so, particularly since '97, when Labour came in. And I think, a lot of people, most people in most countries at most times, with perhaps the partial exception of modern Canadians, are not in favour of large-scale immigration for perfectly rational and irrational reasons. But the rational reasons include the fact that it's likely to increase competition in the labour market. It's likely to increase pressure on public services and so on. And it's likely also, if the levels are too high in certain places and neighbourhoods, it'll lead to over-rapid social change, which a lot of people are discomforted by.
And it comes to this question of identity. Can I ask you about Australia? You've been in Australia, you've been speaking here, and you've looked at Australia as well. The Prime Minister says, and he is right, that we are an extraordinarily successful multicultural country. Do you see the potential for the same tensions here that you've seen in the UK and Europe?
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly the case, and it partly because of the sort of almost the kind of internal civil war that we've been talking about between the groups of people, the more educated people who are comfortable with immigration and indeed benefit from it perhaps in some ways, and those who are less comfortable with it and don't benefit from it. So it antagonises that sort of internal conflict. So what do we have to do to avoid going down that path? I think you have to be very transparent about it, and I think you should debate the numbers of people who are coming in every year, make it very clear why they're coming in. But I think two things that Australia can and is, I think, learning from the broader European and UK experience is very much the importance of integration. Now, you remain a very, very heavily white European society. I mean, kind of 90% plus of Australians have white European heritage. And issues of integration are less complicated, I think, in this. So people come from Italy or Greece, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you had the institutions to help integrate them, whether it was the church or trade unions or whatever. Now you've now got a kind of double whammy in that those kind of institutions of civil society are perhaps rather weaker. Society becomes richer. It tends to become more individualistic. Those institutions perhaps become a bit weaker. But you're also bringing in people who are sort of culturally more distant to the historic base of Australian society, and that does raise issues of.
Islam has been an example of this, and there's certainly been tensions in Europe. Yeah. Here we haven't had the European tensions, but do you see a potential for that? How does Australia avoid that? What is to be learned from the European experience?
Your Minister Alan Tudge talks about a kind of integration multiculturalism rather than a sort of separatist multiculturalism. Obviously nobody wants a separatist multiculturalism, but it has been the product perhaps of a more kind of laissez-faire approach in countries like the UK. So I think you focus very much on the obvious things like making sure that people speak English, obviously making sure that there is no discrimination, but perhaps trying to lean against the boundary maintenance that people, perhaps particularly from more traditional cultures of South Asia or the Islamic world, they actually positively often don't want their children to integrate so far that they lose them from the group. And that is a perfectly understandable kind of human instinct, but it's one that, in a way, a liberal society wants to kind of lean against. I think with Muslims, the experience in the UK is that Muslims tend to remain somewhat more separate, somewhat more segregated than even other South Asian groups. whether it's women on the whole not working, more households that don't that have at least one non-English speaker in them, much more traditional religiosity, much more traditional view of male-female roles, and so on. I mean, all of that means that it's taking longer and is more problematic.
But it's not to say that it wouldn't happen, does it? Because
No.
we still hear a terrific level of integration and, yes, difference and diversity, but still coming together around that, what it is to live in this society, Australia.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting conflicts here is that, particularly if one is a part of kind of mainstream British or Australian politics, but if somewhat socially conservative, one also has a certain sympathy for the reluctance of some minorities to want to integrate into what is sometimes is almost a kind of hyper-liberal society, and that I think a lot of more conservative-minded people have some sympathy, and this is why I think there is a potentially interesting role for some minorities in the future, almost as a sort of bridge between somewhere social conservatism or small c conservatism and kind of anywhere hyperliberalism. I talk about that a little bit in my book, whether that is a role that bridge role is a potentially interesting future possibility.
It's a fascinating issue and a terrific book to read as well, David. Thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thank you very much.